Thank you, Dr. Kroom. It's an honor to be here with you at Judson University. I've been hearing many things for several years about Judson. We share a mutual friend, a big supporter of Judson University in Colorado Springs, also supports many efforts of mine in Colorado Springs. And I had the privilege of meeting several Judson students this past spring, and it really is just a delight to be here and to see your beautiful campus. I also have to say it's nice to be back in Illinois. My father grew up in Bloomington, Normal. So anyone from Bloomington in here? I can't, no Bloomington? I'd be interested in what the town looked. Oh, there we go. Wonderful. Would love to talk about what Bloomington looked. I haven't been there since 1996, but I spent a lot of time as a child in Bloomington Normal going on family vacations to visit my relative there. And of course, ended up becoming a Cubs fan as a result also of that connection. But so it is really wonderful to be back here in Illinois. So today, I want to address two questions or two claims, perhaps make two claims. The first would be, why would institutions like Judson University and Judson students, you, matter for America? Or for the American founders. Another way of putting that as a claim was that the founders thought that a nation like America's could not be morally neutral about the character of its citizens. And I think that's central to the mission of Judson University. The second question or claim would be, why would understanding the founding matter for Judson University and her students, you? Another way of putting that would be, why you cannot be neutral about the character of America, and in particular, the constitutional character of this country. So that first claim, what I mean here is that the American founders thought that religious faith and moral character was indispensable for preserving a constitutional system devoted to equality, freedom, and self-government. Now, very briefly, I do want to make something clear. I'm not claiming that the American founding was a Christian founding. Recently, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas made that claim and said the Constitution was written by God. Don't know where to begin with that. We could start with the word heresy, but maybe we can just leave it there. That's not what I'm claiming. Instead, it's a broader claim. And what I mean is that it is undeniably true that the American founders were profoundly shaped by Christian ideas. And it's difficult to imagine the American constitutional experiment and then the ideas of the American constitutional experiment, which Dr. Kroom mentioned, have now spread throughout the world, having come into existence outside of the influence of Christianity. You can see this in one area. There are scholars who have actually tried to get some kind of quantitative measure of the influence of various authors on the American founders. They've gone and counted the number of times certain authorities were cited in debates over the Constitution, the American founding. And it turns out the Bible is, by a wide margin, the most commonly cited authority. It just suffused their thought. Even people who tried to, shall we say, run away from Christianity, people like Thomas Jefferson, in a way, he was not a Christian, but it seemed like the more he ran away from it, the more he became, in many ways, influenced by Christian ideas. I think this is very true today as well, that we live in a world that is profoundly shaped by Christian ideas, and we often forget this. Some of that is because of the increasingly secular nature of the West. But I'm going to quote Tom Holland, who is an English historian who says that he's an atheist. I don't believe he's changed his opinion on this, but he recently wrote an interesting book called Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. He said this: to live in a Western country is to live in a society still utterly saturated by Christian concepts and assumptions. He also said, today, even as belief in God fades across the West, the countries that were once collectively known as Christendom continue to bear the stamp of the 2 millennia-old revolution that Christianity represents. It is the principal reason why, by and large, most of us who live in post-Christian societies still take for granted that it is nobler to suffer than to inflict suffering. It is why we generally assume that every human life is of equal value. In my morals and ethics, I have learned to accept that I am not Greek or Roman at all. Got to start as writing books about the ancient classical world, the Greek and Roman world. He said, but I am thoroughly and proudly Christian. It's interesting. He's kind of claiming to be a Christian atheist. So one question I think that we have to confront is whether society such as ours can last without this underlying moral foundation. Certainly the American founders did not think so, and that's why I think that Judson University and institutions like it matter. They did not think, again, that a free society could be neutral about the moral characteristics of its citizens. So you can see this in things like the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that was then renewed by the new Congress in 1789. In the Northwest Ordinance, Congress said, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. John Adams, he put it this way, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. John Adams also famously said, and this goes to that point of how America has influenced the rest of the world, and how the ideas of the American founding were going to reshape the world. He said, we began the dance. We began the dance. George Washington, in his farewell address, said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Then he went on to say, and let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. Today, many people reject the claims of John Adams, George Washington, and the ideas that suffuse things like the Northwest Ordinance. They think that you can eliminate the moral foundation for a free society, that you can have equal liberty under the law, and really lose nothing. That is, once we've climbed up the ladder, reached a certain level of development, we can kick away the ladder and nothing will be compromised. I'm not so sure about that. Tom Holland certainly isn't certain about that, but I'll quote some others who I think are uncertain about that. Friedrich Nietzsche, certainly no fan of Christianity or liberalism. By the way, by liberal society, I mean one ordered around rights and equal protection under the law. And he loathed that precisely because it was a descendant of Christianity. Did not think it would have come into existence outside of the Christian world. This is how he put it. They've gotten rid of the Christian God, and now they think they have to hold on to Christian morality all the more. That's English logic. In England, for every little emancipation from theology, you have to make yourself respectable again as a moral fanatic in the most frightening way. Over there, that's the penance one pays. Then he went on to say, things are different for the rest of us. If you give up the Christian faith, you pull the right to Christian morality out from under your feet. And by the way, he meant by Christian morality things like a principle of human equality, which we will come back to. You'll see there's some overlap between the points that I'm going to make today. He says, this morality is simply not self-evident. One has to bring this point home again and again, despite the English dimwits. He was not a fan of the English, who he thought were trying to get rid of the foundation of Christianity, but to preserve Christian morality. He said, Christianity is a system of view of things that is conceived and connected as a whole. If you break off a major concept from it, faith, for instance, you break up the whole as well. There are no necessary truths left to hold on to anymore. So Nietzsche thought that if you get rid of this, eventually it's going to crumble. And that was one of actually his fears about the 20th century, why he thought the 20th century would be the bloodiest in human history. Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote, in my view, the greatest book on democracy and the greatest book on America ever written, called Democracy in America, he put it this way. He said, despotism can do without faith, but freedom cannot. Freedom cannot. So I think for the American founders, for others who have reflected on this question carefully, the existence of institutions like Judson University is absolutely critical for the preservation of the kind of society that was molded by the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Now I want to turn to my second point, though, which is why understanding the American founding should matter to Judson University and to her students, and that would be you. So there's one obvious answer to this, and that is that without the American founding and its commitment to religious liberty, Judson University likely would not exist. But that's too easy. That's not really what I ultimately want to address. Although it is true, and I think that you should be grateful for this. So I mean something more. I think understanding the founding, or the founding properly understood, should make people of faith more appreciative of their freedoms and more confident about their place in our society. So the first thing I'll say is that statecraft is a very difficult thing. And it's truly remarkable that people sitting down in Philadelphia in 1787 were able to craft a document that still governs us today. This was just a remarkable human achievement. It was one of the most extraordinary human achievements ever. People from around the world still stand in awe of this. Despite America has had its struggles, it had its sins, as we all know, it was still a remarkable achievement. It's difficult to actually frame a government that is going to last, particularly one that's based on, as the founder said, reflection and choice rather than accident and force. Because for most of human history, that's how people were governed, accident or force. Someone conquered you, that meant you were governed by that person. Someone else happened to come into power by accident, then you were governed by them. But they actually sat down and thought about what kind of society do we want to live in? What kind of governmental structure is most suitable for a people of our nature? So that's one thing that I think that you should appreciate. But I want to look more closely both at the Declaration of Independence and at the Constitution, just a few features of both that I think should make them more compelling to all of you in this room. So first of all, the Declaration of Independence. I'll just go ahead and mention that the Declaration does mention God 4 times. And these were not throwaway lines. Sometimes people will try to dismiss them, and I will cite some evidence here that I think indicates that they were not throwaway lines. But I want to look at 3 claims in the Declaration of Independence. First, human equality. It's a claim in the Declaration that we are all equal, And they knew this was a very radical claim, and they knew that it was announcing a moral standard that they were going to be held accountable to and that they were violating. And the most obvious example of that was, of course, slavery. They knew this. But that made it remarkable as well, that they were actually announcing a standard, a moral standard to the rest of the world that they knew that they were not measuring up to. But I think there's something else important about equality. What can be a basis for human equality? And in particular, equality of rights. What can be a foundation for that? It's simply not enough to want it. That's mere sentiment. If you just like it, well, I like human equality. Well, what if someone else doesn't? What do you do in that instance? There has to be something that attaches you to this principle that's deeper and stronger than just mere sentiment. So Jeremy Waldron, a very, very prominent political philosopher, legal philosopher, taught at Oxford, at NYU. He wrote a very interesting book on John Locke, who of course had a profound influence on the American founders and the writing of the Declaration of Independence. Now, Locke's influence is sometimes exaggerated. But even if it is exaggerated, there's no denying he was still extremely important for the founding generation, particularly in the years leading up to the writing of the Declaration of Independence. And in this book, Jeremy Waldron essentially says, looking back to Locke, who also argued for human equality, what was the foundation for that? And Waldron's answer is theology. It must be grounded in a kind of theological claim. Otherwise, it just falls into mere sentiment. And he argued that Locke was serious about this. And then Jefferson, who was profoundly influenced by Locke, and then all the other members of the Congress who were really all the authors of the Declaration of Independence, I think they took this seriously as well. So here is what Jeremy Waldron says. These are the last sentences from his book. He says, "Equality cannot do its work unless it is accepted among those whom it consecrates as equals. Locke believed this general acceptance was impossible apart from the principle's foundation in religious teaching. We believe otherwise," talking about those of us living in the secular West today. He says, "Locke, I suspect, would have thought we were taking a risk. and I'm afraid it is not entirely clear, given our experience in which politics and public reason have cut loose from these foundations, that his cautions and suspicions were unjustified. So these were serious claims, but they had to be grounded in something substantial beyond just, we like this. There's also a claim of liberty. We all are equal in our rights, and particularly life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So liberty itself, what do they mean by liberty? Well, of course, they thought that in order to be a free person, you needed to be largely free to structure your own life and order it in a way that you thought was proper. However, they were deeply afraid that liberty would turn to licentiousness. So it needed to be controlled as well. That is, liberty must be seasoned with morality and virtue. Without those things, they, again, will collapse liberty. A free society risk collapsing into licentiousness. And then with that, you're simply going to have to call upon the government to do more controlling of our lives. And as the government becomes more powerful, the less free you become. James Wilson of the founding generation, he simply put it this way: without liberty, law loses its nature and its name and becomes oppression. Without law, liberty also loses its nature and its name and becomes licentiousness. Now, the final claim from the Declaration, which I think we need to dwell on a little bit, is the claim about human happiness, that there's a right to the pursuit of happiness and what they meant by that. Today, I think there's a common high school understanding of the pursuit of happiness, which is whatever I think is going to make me happy at this particular moment counts as happiness, and therefore I have a right to pursue that. That is not what they meant by this. That is not what they meant by this. Again, this phrase, pursuit of happiness, was actually used by John Locke in his essay concerning human understanding. And here's how he defined the pursuit of happiness. He said, the necessity of pursuing happiness is the foundation of liberty, as therefore the highest perfection of intellectual nature lies in a careful and constant pursuit of true and solid happiness. So the care of ourselves, that we mistake not imaginary for real happiness, is the necessary foundation of our liberty. The stronger ties we have to an unalterable pursuit of happiness in general, which is our greatest good, and which as such our desires always follow, the more are we free from any necessary determination of our will to any particular action. So what does that mean? That actually means that the pursuit of happiness means the inculcation of proper virtues and behavior that then liberate us, truly liberate us from our instincts and passions. That's how Locke defined the pursuit of happiness. William Blackstone, who wrote his commentaries on the laws of England, who also had a profound influence on the founding generation, he put it this way. He said that natural law, he defined natural law as God's one paternal precept, that man should pursue his own true and substantial happiness. True happiness again. Not something that is just driven by the whims of the moment, your appetites of the moment, but something that you have to work in your own life to develop. That's what they meant by the pursuit of happiness. So true happiness is the liberation from our immediate desires. I would think at an institution like Justin University, this would sound familiar. Just think of Romans 7:19. For I do not the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing. They were trying to liberate us from these passions. So the Declaration of Independence, properly understood, I think teaches something that is common, other than what is commonly thought in our society today. Now I want to turn to the Constitution itself. The Constitution itself. Because there are parts of the Constitution that have been distorted and misunderstood, but they directly affect institutions like this one, and therefore directly affect you, and I think could potentially affect future generations as well. So if you look at the Constitution, in Article 1, the people who wrote it actually listed the powers that were given to Congress. They listed them. And they did that intentionally. And they emphasized this in what's known as the vesting clause of Article 1, because they said that all the legislative powers herein granted. And what that means is that What powers does Congress have? Only the ones that are granted, explicitly given to Congress. One thing that this means is that Congress, the national government, does not have something called the police power. The police power. Sorry for getting too technical with you, but the police power is what's known as a general power of government to regulate, to protect the health, welfare, safety, and morals of the people. They explicitly did not want to give that power to Congress. Instead, they wanted to limit Congress's powers under what's known as the doctrine of enumerated powers. Congress would be restrained and limited because the powers it had were only the ones listed in Article 1 of the Constitution. Now, what that means is that if you adopt an approach to interpreting the Constitution that ends up giving Congress something that looks like the police power, you must have made a wrong turn. There's been an interpretive mistake somewhere. And I would argue that we have been in a nearly century-long period of an interpretive mistake, at least going back to the late 1930s and early 1940s. Because what the Supreme Court has done is it has interpreted what's known as the Commerce Clause. Congress has the authority to regulate commerce among the states. It's known as the Interstate Commerce Clause. The way the Supreme Court has interpreted the Commerce Clause has essentially given Congress a police power. What they have said is that if there's something that the federal government, the national government, can claim will have a substantial effect on commerce, that is, even if it's not commerce itself, if you can claim that it has a substantial effect, if enough people do it, then Congress can regulate it. The most famous case where the court said this was called Wickard versus Filbert, and under that, a farmer in Ohio was punished by the Department of Agriculture because he had grown too much wheat on his farm. And under the Agricultural Adjustment Acts, he was limited in the percent or the amount of wheat that he could grow, and so he grew his allotted amount of wheat, but then he grew extra wheat simply to feed himself and his animals on his farm. And the federal government said, you are not allowed to do this, because even though he said, look, this isn't commerce. I'm just growing this wheat, consuming it on my own farm. I'm not going out and selling it. The federal government said, if enough people do that, it could affect the interstate market for wheat, and therefore we can regulate it. That means almost anything is within the sphere of potential congressional regulation. The principle would actually allow for Congress to tell you that you can't grow tomatoes in your backyard garden. Now, under the Agricultural Adjustment Acts, people will say, oh, this only addressed farms of a certain size. But that doesn't matter. The principle itself would allow them to reach into your backyard garden and say, you can't grow tomatoes there because if you grow tomatoes, then you won't go to, I don't know what the grocery stores are around here, King Soopers back where I'm from. You won't go to King Soopers and buy tomatoes. And that could affect the interstate market for tomatoes. This clearly, I think, if you go and look at the founders, violates their understanding of the powers of Congress. You can see it. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 32. He said, an entire consolidation of the states into one complete national sovereignty would imply an entire subordination of the parts, and whatever powers might remain in them would be altogether dependent on the general will. But as the plan of the convention aims only at a partial union or consolidation, the state governments would clearly retain all the rights of sovereignty which they before had, and that would be this general police power, and which were not by that act exclusively delegated to the United States. James Madison, in Federalist 39, Federalist Papers being the most famous explanation of the purposes of the Constitution. He said the jurisdiction of the federal government only extends to certain enumerated objects and leaves to the several states a residuary and inviolable sovereignty over all other objects. In Federalist 45, he says the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in state governments are numerous and indefinite. So, what does this mean for you? Well, there's simply no doubt that there are elements within the national government which want a complete consolidation of the nature of education in America. And they try to use their authority to kind of impose what you could call, I think, an improper understanding of equality. What they think that equality means is everything must be the same, and therefore institutions that might be different from others, there is something wrong with them and are in need of federal tutelage. So that means that institutions like Judson University are at risk of falling afoul of some federal regulation. And most of this, again, has come underneath the Commerce Clause authority of Congress, which the Supreme Court has dramatically expanded. So I would think a proper understanding of the doctrine of enumerated powers and then what has happened with the Commerce Clause would make this university and its students concerned about this development and hope that there might be some correction. Then the last point that I want to bring up would be the Bill of Rights, and particularly freedom of religion. Again, an issue that should be deeply important to those of you in this room. There's a reason that you're here, I suspect, that is related to this. So first, again, the Supreme Court, really starting in 1947, read something into the First Amendment that was not actually there. What the Supreme Court said was that the Establishment Clause requires a high wall of separation between church and state, and they took that phrase from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association. Interestingly, the Danbury Baptist Association actually didn't agree with Jefferson on this, even though they had appealed to him really to protect them. But even if you understand it as Jefferson understood it, what he was saying was that religion should be protected from government. That was the primary point that he was trying to make. But even his understanding has been distorted. The other thing that's important to recognize about that phrase, high wall of separation, it does come from Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had nothing to do with the writing of the Bill of Rights. He was in France at the time, and his understanding of the proper relationship between church and state simply would not have been adopted by Congress or the states, and it would not have been then included in the Bill of Rights. Same with James Madison, who is often considered his understanding of the relationship between church and state should be the controlling one. Madison essentially admitted that his preferences on religion were not embodied in the First Amendment. So instead, what were they trying to do with the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause? Really, the Establishment Clause was there to buttress the Free Exercise Clause. I think that's the proper understanding of what they were trying to do. The Establishment Clause was forbidding a national church, but it was also, at the time, actually protecting state-established churches. But also what they were trying to do was, because they did not think that it would be inappropriate for government to do certain things that might support religion, but they wanted to do so on a non-discriminatory basis. So that if they're going to support religion, they wouldn't do it in a way that would just benefit the Anglican church, or the Presbyterian church, or the Congregationalist church. And then they thought that would help buttress the Free Exercise Clause. I think you can see some of this understanding of the importance of religion for them by, again, looking at some of what they said. Samuel Adams, one of the leaders of the American Revolution in Massachusetts, he said, "Every man living in or out of our state of civil society has a right peaceably and quietly to worship God according to the dictates of his conscience. Just and true liberty, equal and impartial liberty in matters spiritual and temporal, is a thing that all men are clearly entitled to by the eternal and immutable laws of God and nature, as well as by the laws of nations and all well-grounded municipal laws, which must have their foundation in the former." Going back to the Northwest Ordinance, again, "No person demeaning himself in a peaceable and orderly manner shall ever be molested on account of his mode of worship or religious sentiments in the said territory." Again, emphasizing the importance of free exercise for them. Now, you still see, I think, a distorted understanding of the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause even today. Most recently, there's a case from Yeshiva University in New York City. Now, if you know anything about this university, it's an Orthodox Jewish university. And as an Orthodox Jewish university, it maintains certain standards. And some people don't like those standards. And so they sued to try to compel this Orthodox Jewish university to change its standards, which they claim are based on their religion. A New York judge ruled that even though the university explicitly, this is what they say, tries to follow the spirit of the Torah, that it is not, in fact, a religious institution or corporation, that instead it is merely an educational corporation and therefore can be controlled by New York law. I do not think that this decision will actually survive review, but it is, an example of where this distorted understanding of the First Amendment has led us. And I would think that Judson University, these kinds of concerns about these attempts to manipulate the standards that are established here should be of importance to you. So I do hope, and given the last Supreme Court term, given some cases out of Maine and Washington State, that there will be a correction where this relationship between the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause will be reordered and put back into proper alignment, and therefore cases like this one out of New York City won't happen anymore, but it is still there. It is still there. But again, I think that a proper understanding of this should give you greater confidence in your status and position in the society. Because often people will say that there should almost be a state of hostility between religion and the state or government. And that is not what was intended by the American founders, nor by the First Amendment. So to conclude, I just want to say, you have been given something important, something significant. The very fact that you are in this room means that you have been blessed far more than most people who have ever lived on this planet. Sometimes people like to say that to be born into America or to live into America is to win the lottery, just by being here. And in many ways that's true. People born into America, regardless of their socioeconomic status, will probably have a milder and gentler life than most people who have ever lived upon this earth. And much of the reason for that is because of the work that was done to establish a free society in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But it also means more for you. You are being given a particular kind of education. And as I think you know, to whom much is given, much shall be required. So my hope and my prayer for you is that you will take what you have given when you leave this campus and do what you can to preserve the kind of free society that allows you to be here today. Thank you.